Well, everybody, welcome back to a new lore lecture. I'm glad you were all able to make it today. I wish to apologize for this lecture being scheduled so late and for so little people to be able to attend. Unfortunately, I couldn't get consensus, as I already told you in a previous message. I wish I could have done this lecture earlier, but work for university and personal issues basically kept me from being able to schedule this one, so it's a bit later than I had planned. Now, before we begin, I reckon that everybody present knows the rules. Keep your microphone muted during the lecture. In the middle of it, we will have a 10-minute break, in which we can answer some questions if they're really urgent, but I again urge you to keep non-urgent questions until after the lecture, because I know that we have some people that are on a time schedule today, so yeah, it would be appreciated by everyone to be able to speed up with the lecture. So in the break, you can just fill your drinks, go to the toilet, or ask a really urgent question if it is there. Also, I wish to make you guys aware again that this is not a normal lore video. While in previous lectures I was basically able to tell you everything that we know about some periods, that was because we did not know much about that period, and every little shred of information we have could be relevant. Think about the Dawn era, where we don't know much, and basically everything that we know can be extrapolated to something to connect the dots. But we are now entering a period, the second half of the Merethic era, where we have a lot more information, and in future lectures we will have even more information, for example during the first, second and third era. And due to the grand scale of this lecture series on big history, trying to give a large overview of everything that happens, I have to make choices in what I will present. A good example is when I talk about a Dwemer, I really shortly make comments on their speculated religious history and conflict with the other races, but I'll not go into detail in the especially religion of theirs or into the conflicts themselves, as if I did that with everything, we would be sitting here for over 7 hours, since there's just way too much ground to cover. So expect this to be a general summary and just focus on the important points. I also assume that all of you were present during the last two lectures, or if you weren't able to be present, then you have watched them on YouTube, as I will base a lot of today's lecture on the information that I gave you in the last one. To recap very shortly, in the last lecture, Merethic Era Part 1, we talked about how the different races ended up on their respective continents, what developments they've made on their respective continents, and a little bit of history on the pre-Tamrielic migration era, when the races were all still confined to their own continents. We talked a little bit about how the races like the Khajiit and Marmor came to be, so the Sea Elves, and talked about the first few transcontinental migrations. First the Marmor from Altmeris to Piendene, and next the dragons from Akavir to Admora, the homeland of the humans. And we talked a bit about the first race that would get extinct, the left-handed elves, or at least the first race that we know of that got extinct. And this is pretty much the point where we left off during the last lecture, just before the different races would go on their own migration waves to Tamriel. Today we will continue to talk about the Merethic era, and now in part 2, Tamrielic history, in which we will focus more on historical development rather than the technological and evolutional development that we talked about last time. As I said, last time we left off just before the great waves of migration to Tamriel. Every race was still sitting on their own continent, Yokuda on Yokudans on Yokuda, Needs on Admora, Aldmer on Altmeris, and Khajiit and Argonians on Tamriel. These will probably be the races most involved in this lecture, because there are other continents, specifically Akavir with the Sesi and the hypothesized Akavir humans, and Piendene with the Marmor, and to an extent Yokuda and the Yokudans. But we know very little, well actually next to nothing, about their concrete history during this time of the Merethic era, when the Great Migrations took place, and afterwards. Most of their concrete history shows up post-First Era, because we literally don't know much about them prior to that. Now, something interesting that we will see in this lecture with the Needs and the Aldmer, and later in the First Era with the Redguards, is that their migration to Tamriel usually wasn't in any way voluntary. Each race migrated to Tamriel because their homeland had found some kind of doom, which made their homeland either disappear or maybe uninhabitable. The only original homeland of a race that did not happen to, and who came to Tamriel basically voluntary and for non-homeland related reasons, as far as we know at least, is Akavir. The Akavir races have invaded Tamriel in the past, as we probably all know, but as far as we know, these invasions never happened because their homeland was failing. Their trips to Tamriel were never on a mass migration scale or of a migration nature, it were just military attacks. Now, as most people know, the first race to make a trip to Tamriel on a grand migration scale were the ancestors of the Tamrielic elven races, the Aldmer, with a D, not with a T, because with a T is the High Elf that we know from the current games. They came from the ancestral homeland of the elves, which is Aldmeris. There are many theories on whether Aldmeris was real, if it did exist, or if it's just a collection of memories. While that collection of memories thing is a real interesting theory, I think that this is one of those theories in the Elder Scrolls lore that we basically have a lot of, which is overcomplication for no reason. I admit that some of these kind of far-fetched and vague theories on Aldmeris, for example, being a collection of memories and never really existing, and that it were memories from the Dawn era that remained there because the Aldmer were like the offspring of the gods. Those theories have some merit in the lore that we know. But for this lecture I disregard most, if not all of them, as either religion or as non-canon. Because I try to simplify and bring the lore back to what we do know for sure, and the things that are at least logical, and that we connect the dots in a way that makes sense and that is grounded, instead of creating a million of small theories that get ever more elaborate, while there is perfectly reasonable and simple alternative solutions that, to me at least, make a lot more sense in the grand scheme of things. So for this lecture series we will presume that Aldmeris was, or maybe even is, a real place. As I specified in the last lecture, there is merit to assume that Aldmeris was modeled after or built upon, or even was, Old Elnothe, the mythical home of the Elnothe. And it could perhaps be regarded as one of the first places on Nirn to be inhabited, together with Atmora, Tamriel, Yokuda and Akavir, which all had their own races on it. What's interesting about Aldmeris though is that it was probably the most advanced place on Nirn until some strange doom befell it. It is said that it was an endless city built upon itself for many levels, expanded into the beyond of their continent until nothing of nature remained on the continent, just one giant beautiful city. It said that many of the Aldmer that fled to Tamriel did so because a strange danger lurked in the beyond that would be a doom to Aldmeris for some reason. But what exactly this doom was, nobody ever specified. It's just said that the Aldmer fled their doomed homeland, and it's not really told why. And the only explanations that we do have are out of game, and are really vague and don't tell us much else. After the initial waves of migration from Aldmeris, the majority of Aldmer landed on the islands of Somerset, with their first landing happening on the island of Auridon, which is the smaller of the two main Somerset Isles. Here they started a new civilization after they ridded the island of some fearsome native creatures and pretty much modeled their society on the island after the one they had on Aldmeris, but now on Auridon. And not much later they expanded their civilization onto the bigger island of Eleanor. Things worked out pretty well for them. They founded the first couple of cities on the Somerset Isles. The first city they founded was Firsthold, meaning it was the first city that we know of that was founded on Tamriel by people not native to Tamriel. Life was pretty good in their civilization apparently. Due to many fearsome native creatures it was a dangerous place to live, but the Aldmer held on and built their civilization on the islands, eventually ridding it of most danger and creating an advanced society on the Somerset Isles in these early periods. However, there were several groups of Aldmer that for one reason or another decided to leave the Somerset Isles and search for their luck elsewhere on Tamriel. The first group to leave and settle somewhere else on Tamriel were the group of Aldmer that would later evolve into the Dwemer. We don't know exactly why the Dwemer left the main group of Aldmer on the Somerset Isles, but if I have to guess, it's most likely due to religious differences. While the Aldmer worshipped their ancestors, who they saw as the divines, we know that the Dwemer despised the gods or the divines, and they despised those with divine power as they wanted it for themselves. A predicament which would eventually lead to their rapid technological advancements when they had settled somewhere else in Tamriel. So I suspect that this religious aspect was most likely part of the reason for these Aldmer to break off from the main group in the Somerset Isles and look for a place on Tamriel to mind their own business. They travelled across Tamriel until they came to a volcanic land filled with mountains and ash. And for some reason they decided, yeah, we should settle here, in the mountains and the ash. But they did it, and this group of Aldmer settled into what's now modern-day Morrowind. Over time they would build many cities, most, if not all of them, deep underground. Presumably their underground cities came to be as a sort of shelter for the ash of Red Mountain, but we don't know exactly the motive of why they would build most of their cities underground. And if they built anything above ground, usually there was a bigger underground part. Think for example about Markarth. Later, when other races of elves would settle in different parts of Tamriel, they would call this elven breed that would settle in Morrowind the Dwemer, which translates to the Deep Elves, after they had seen the deep underground cities of them they built. And their land of Morrowind would be called Dwemereth. Whether they themselves as a race accepted and embraced the name Dwemer or Deep Elf, or the name Dwemereth for their country is unknown, but we at least know that it was called that way by the other races. After the Dwemer, many other elves would leave the Somerset Isles to see what they could accomplish on Tamriel. We know that the Dwemer were the first group to leave, and we also know that the last one were the Chimer, or the precursors of the Dunmer, but we don't know quite in what order the elves left Somerset, other than those two. As I said, many other elves would leave the Somerset Isles. Some settled close to the Somerset Isles and some far away. For example, a group of Altmer left the Somerset Isles for Valenwood. They would later evolve into the Bosmer, or the Wood Elves. Other elves would settle further away from the Somerset Isles, like the group of Altmer that settled into Skyrim and would evolve into what we now know as the Falmer, or Snow Elves as they want to be called themselves. I'm sorry, but we usually call them Snow Elves, as that's what they want to be called themselves, or at least the few that remained by this day and age. Other elves that would settle further away were the Dareni clan, who settled in High Rock around the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfira and the surrounding High Rock coasts. In modern-day Cyrodiil, the group of elves that would become the Aeliots settled and began conquering the province. And finally, a group of Altmer would be led by the prophet Veloth to Morrowind, and they would inhabit the overworld of Morrowind and would become the Chimer, while the Dwemer ruled the world below. In almost every corner of Tamriel there were now elves, except in Elsewhere and Blackmarsh, which were still inhabited by their native beastfolk, like the Argonians and the Khajiit and the Lilmoth in Blackmarsh. We know that around this time, the Argonians at least, were the most advanced race that they have been. Not the most advanced race, but they were the most advanced that they have ever been. They had the great Zanmir culture during this time, and they built great pyramids. It is only after the elves started expanding on Tamriel that their culture would decline into what we see now, which is quite curious, and we don't really have an explanation given for it. We know that they were very advanced, but we also know that they declined their culture, and part of it I think has to do with the Hist. But why exactly they suddenly started declining after the elves came, I don't really have a good explanation for it, and the lore, as far as I have been able to find, also does not give a good explanation for it. While I claimed in the previous lectures that the Khajiit most likely stemmed from the common ancestor of the elves, the old Elnove inhabitants, I no longer count the Khajiit among the elves at this point, as if my theory goes up that they have the same ancestor, they have already evolved at this point so radically away from the main branch of Altmer and have such a different looks and characteristics that we can safely count the Khajiit as their own race. And for them, basically the same predicament goes up as for the Argonians, except that we know even less about the Khajiit. We know that the Khajiit were ordered in kingdoms, and that they had their own kingdoms in Elsewhere and presumably some other regions. But we don't know exactly if they were more advanced back then, or if they were less advanced back then. We simply don't know much about the Khajiit or the Argonians in the Merethic era, unfortunately. Probably because the elves were the main documentation source and they probably did not document a lot on them. I don't exactly know, and the lore doesn't tell us either. However, in a sense, this moment where the elves started expanding on Tamriel could be called the true beginning of the Merethic era, as it's only now that the elves dominate each corner of Tamriel. And after the break I will talk some more about the happenings on Tamriel during this age, and we will see the humans appear on Tamriel. And yeah, I think I'll see you all back in 5 minutes, as I will now shortly have a break, and if anyone has a really urgent question, you get the chance to tell me, and I'll turn my other recording software on. So if you have any questions, tell me in the chat and I'll turn my other recording software on, and if you don't have any questions, then I will start as soon as I've refilled my glass. Okay, so welcome back. Before the break we talked a little bit about how the elvish races spread over Tamriel, and now we will talk about what kind of different things the different races were doing on Tamriel. And I'm gonna warn you that if you were thinking that I was skipping over things too fast in the first half of this lecture, you're gonna have a problem with this half, because I'm gonna go through the history very fast, because we still have 4 pages to go of the 8, and there's a lot more information in this, so I'm sorry. One of the most interesting things that happened during the Merethic era, at least in my opinion, is the construction of the towers. While I will not be covering tower lore in this series, I still find it interesting to at least glance over the subject really quickly, as I know that some people will appreciate it. When the different groups of Altmer that would evolve into the elvish races left the Somerset Isles, then the ancient adamantine tower built by the gods in High Rock on the Isle of Balfira was rediscovered by the Durrani elves. If you want to know more about the Durrani elves and want to know more about how the tower got constructed, the adamantine tower, I recommend watching the first lore lecture in the series of the Dawn era and my video on the Durrani. But as this tower was rediscovered, some of the elvish races decided to build a tower in its image of their own. Like the Aelids built the White Gold Tower as it's known now and dubbed it the Temple of the Ancestors, which was one of their most important places of worship. And the Altmer on the Somerset Isles that would evolve into the Altmer, so the High Elves, built the Crystal Tower in the image of the Adamantine Tower, which would also become an important center of their civilization. This topic of the towers is highly interesting on itself, but as I said before, I cover history on such a grand scale in these lectures that I don't really have to delve into detail, and I really need to keep myself to that, otherwise we'll be sitting here way longer than the half hour that I usually use for the lore lectures. Now, as the White Gold Tower, or Temple of the Ancestors, was being constructed by the Aelids did quite well for themselves. They managed to establish a large-scale empire in central Tamriel, spanning across Cyrodiil and even parts of Blackmarsh, as we know that some of the most northeastern cities in Blackmarsh are actually founded by the Aelids, northwestern cities. Their empire was very advanced in magic and architecture, and they are said to have preserved many of the Dawn era magics from the Elnofey, as one of the few elvish races, and they used this powerful magic to get a tighter grip over their land. Essentially, this empire was mostly feudal in nature, with several independent Aelid kingdoms being united in one empire, but then all these little kingdoms would have far-reaching autonomy. In their society, slavery had an important role, as slaves were basically being used for nearly all forms of work as far as we know. Their large slave workforce was made up of the different beastfolk of Tamriel, so Argonians and Khajiit for the most part, who were forced to serve them as the Aelids were powerful enough to keep them under their thumb. Later on, humans would also be integrated into the Aelid slave workforce, but we will talk about that later in the story. The Aelids were very advanced and kept advancing in magic, constructing things like the Wilkin Stones and the Aelid Wells, demonstrating that they had a grasp of magic that most of the races don't have even in modern day Tamriel. Near the end of the Merethic era, a big shift in their society would take place. For an unknown reason to us, Daedric worship got a hold of their empire, and basically cults of Daedra worshippers started to take the Aelid empire in its grip. The Aelids did not really make a distinction between good and bad gods in a sense, and they just worshipped all of the gods equally. So even Daedra, that could be argued to be bad by most races, like Maroon's Dagon and Molag Bal, got freely worshipped within the Aelid Empire. And at one point, the worship of the Daedra got a bigger priority than the worship of the Aedra. Strangely, this is not really directly the thing that would bring down their empire in the first era. It would only be loosely related, as the humans would be the main cause of their empire's downfall, as we will see in the first era lecture, because their downfall would only happen in the first era. To the north of the Aelid Empire, in Skyrim, another civilization had embedded itself, the civilization of the Snow Elves, or the Falmer. According to legend, their society was as advanced as the Altmer and the Aelids, and like their Altmer counterparts, they were very spiritual, constructing large chantries of worship like the chantry of Ariel that we can find in Skyrim. We know that religion was almost the center of their society in a way. During the ending years of the Merethic era, another race of Mer was moving into Skyrim, deep underground, the Dwemer, who were building new cities in Skyrim underground as they were looking for the fabled Ethereum ore. As they expanded into Skyrim, they maintained a loose alliance with the Snow Elves, presumably not really bothering each other too much. I mean, the Dwemer kept themselves underground and the Snow Elves kept themselves on the surface, and neither, as far as we know, really bothered each other. They had different goals. The Snow Elves just wanted to worship and the Dwemer just wanted to dig. So there weren't too many problems. However, the Dwemer in this are a very curious case, as well, as we said before, they had founded their first few city-states in Morrowind underground and initially did not really much stood out. Wait, sorry, what did I write down? Oh. They founded their first few city-states in Morrowind underground and initially they did not really stand out from the other elvish races, but as time progressed, they became more technologically advanced. Now, why exactly this is, I explained in my video on the Dwemer, which has a better explanation than I'm gonna give in this one. So it's actually my second ever video, so I recommend watching it if you want to know more about it. But the gist of it is that the Dwemer hated and to an extent denied the gods, and they wanted godly power for themselves. And wanted to mock the gods to an extent by using their magic to create technology to do the work for them instead of doing the work themselves, even if it involved magicka, like the rest of the races do. From this drive to rival the gods and to even get better than the gods, the Dwemer thrived in terms of technology. Instead of using magic to solve their problems like all the other races do, they used magic to make something that would solve their problems for them. Think about the animunculi and the dwarven spheres and the dwarven spiders. This unorthodox approach, which led to their immense technological advancements, are directly linked with their hatred for the gods, something that is sort of unique in their society. No other societies really despised and wanted to mock the gods on that level. I mean, some of them despised some of the gods, but the Dwemer just had a hatred for everything divine, and they were more or less jealous of everything that was divine. Because they wanted the power for themselves in the end, which we will see in the lecture on the First Era when they will construct a new medium, and as far as we know, their society would get lost, but we will get to that later. This, however, is a completely different approach to problems and religion that set the Dwemer on a completely different path of technological advancement than the rest of Tamriel's civilizations, and made their advancement skyrocket, while the other civilizations, they would eventually just stagnate in their technological development. Out of their technological advancement would also result territorial expansion. The Dwemer would settle all over Morrowind now, helped by their technological advancements in terms of like the animunculi, so the robots that would help them construct their cities. Especially Vvardenfell got colonized, and near the end of the Merethic era they would settle into Skyrim as well. However, unlike their peaceful coexistence with the Snow Elves in Skyrim, the Dwemer did not coexist very peacefully with the other inhabitants of modern-day Morrowind, the Chimer, a breed of Altmer that would later devolve into the Dunmer. The Chimer, as a group of Altmer, they had followed the prophet Veleth out of the Somerset Isles, and under his leadership they had settled in Morrowind with their own high culture and religion, which was different from the rest of Tamriel in the sense that it only worshipped three gods, and those were the three Daedra, Boethia, Azura and Mephala. This was High Velety culture, which was founded by the prophet Veleth, who had led them away, saying that he spoke for the goddess Boethia, which is actually a Daedra, but they just saw them as gods. When they arrived in Morrowind under Veleth, they claimed Morrowind for themselves and called it Resdain. However, this sparked problems with the inhabitants that were already there, the Dwemer. For years, both civilizations existed relatively peacefully next to each other, but there was always a tense, and regularly they had disputes with the Dwemer, which sometimes resulted even into small wars and conflict. However, over the years, the Velety people managed to establish themselves tightly in Morrowind, having quite an advanced society centered around their religion and their three gods. It's speculated that around this time, two new races came to Tamriel. Somewhere around the same time of the Velety migrations of the Chimer to Morrowind, another group of Altmer were transformed into the Orcs, which would settle into small parts of northern Tamriel, founding their own smaller kingdoms like Orsinium. How exactly this Orcish transformation happened, and if there even was a transformation, we don't really know. Most people think, including the Orcs themselves, that it's linked to Malakath, but there are different theories on it, and some people even think that they don't even stem from the Mer races at all, and that rather the orcs are just a type of beast folk that already existed on Tamriel before everyone else. But if you follow the previous lectures, you know that I find that theory unlikely, but it's still possible. But more importantly, around the same time, the first men arrived on Tamriel from Atmora. In the beginning, their small waves of migration were largely unnoticed. These men, the Needs as we call them, the ancestors of all light-skinned modern-day human races, they settled in the northern part of Tamriel, some landing in High Rock, some landing in Skyrim. Some groups made trips to Cyrodiil, so to the south of Skyrim, and settled there, and some settled in Hammerfell. It's speculated that the Needs would migrate from Atmora because Atmora was experiencing a rapid decline in prosperity. As it was getting colder, harvests were getting worse, and civil wars were being waged. Of all the places where the Needs were able to settle, they thrived most in Hammerfell. I believe they even called it the Deadlands because it was very hot and no other elves were able to settle there. However, here Needic culture was dominant for a long while until the Dwemer and Yokudan groups would go there. But at this time, Yokuda was still engulfed in its own wars on the continent, and the continent did not face doom yet, so we won't see the Yokudans appearing on Tamriel until the next lecture, when they would basically take over all of Hammerfell from the Needs. Hammerfell was the only province on Tamriel that wasn't already dominated by the elves, and thus the human civilization thrived there, while the other parts of Tamriel, the humans did not thrive as much. Because at some point, the amount of migrated Needs on Tamriel was so great that the elven empires were starting to take notice. The Aelids just saw another race that was ready for enslavement and turned the Needs into their new slaves. The Renni of High Rock saw the Needs as second-class citizens, and while they coexisted relatively peacefully there was still a lot of discrimination, as they basically lived on the lowest level of the feudal system. And, well, I don't know if I'm gonna get demonetized for saying this, but basically there was a law among the Renni elves that the Renni elves could just, how do I say this delicately, screw any human they just wanted, which would eventually lead to the birth of the Breton race, the Manmer race. However, we will also see that in the First Era lecture. And finally there was the Snow Elves of Skyrim, which would coexist peacefully with the Needs, but at one point they just started perceiving the men, so the Needs, as rivals or threats, which would result into a great conflict down the line, because as the Needs expanded their little city-state of Saarthal in the north of Skyrim, they were attacked by the Snow Elves. Presumably this attack was motivated out of fear of being surpassed, and out of fear for Skyrim eventually falling under the hands of the humans completely instead of their own. But other theories say that it was out of their desire to steal an artifact that the humans had found under Saarthal, the Eye of Magnus. But since it's so long ago, and since we only have the sources from human sides, we don't quite know why this attack happened. It's fully possible that maybe the humans even provoked the attack on Saarthal, but if that's true, then we don't know it, because as we know, the winners write history, and in this case there are very, very little sources from the Snow Elf side and a lot from the human side. So yeah. The Snow Elves attacked Saarthal and they basically murdered every human in the city-state. Only very few survived, and those fled back to Atmora and vowed to take revenge. The head of this band of survivors of Saarthal was Ysgramor, who returned to Atmora to find it in relative peace. He then told the stories of elven brutality to his kinsmen in Atmora and got many of his fellow Atmorans riled up, and they followed him back to Tamriel in order to take revenge. So this army that went back to Tamriel was called the Army of the 500 Companions, that we probably all heard about if you've played Skyrim. This army sailed back to Tamriel and they would start slaying the Snow Elves. They first took back Saarthal in revenge and then split their army up to go all over Skyrim and slay the elves in every different direction to take revenge for their massacre at Saarthal. This started the downfall of the Snow Elf civilization, and the foundations of the first Empire of Man would be laid here, as the armies of Ysgramor plunged themselves on Skyrim, rapidly taking over and slaughtering the Snow Elves and removing their empire with every bit of strength that they could muster. This could be called the beginning of the end of the Elvish dominance on Tamriel, and thus the beginning of the end of the Merethic era in a sense, as they hunted down the Snow Elves, their empire was ripped to shreds, and they were forced to make their last stand on Solstheim, which they also lost. This resulted in the remaining snow elves to become desperate and seek out the Dwemer for help, and the Dwemer accepted them into their cities for shelter against the Nords, but only on the condition that they would eat a special fungus or mushroom that would render them blind. This turned out to be a mistake, as we probably all know by now if you've played Skyrim once in your life, as the Snow Elves would be quickly betrayed and enslaved by the Dwemer, and eventually this enslavement and this horrendous betrayal eventually led to them to devolve into the Twisted Falmer that we know today, and those are the very filthy creatures that we always find underground. While if you ever met the Snow Elf that still remains in current day Tamriel, then you know that that's very different from the way that they once were. So definitely the whole Sarthal incident did not really go the Snow Elves' way in the end. Of course, not all Snow Elves were turned by the Dwemer. Some survived in small enclaves like the Forgotten Vale, and some survived even far longer as a secret society, presumably deep into the First Era, some even. But their dominance and their power was at this point long gone, with most of their race enslaved or in hiding. It was also around this time when a decline in Khmer Merethic culture would happen. Their culture would somehow devolve from being very sophisticated into a more tribal-like culture, as we see it in the Ashlanders of Morrowind. Although these cultures would then later evolve again into the Great Houses of Morrowind, but that's material for a later lecture. Now, the second to last thing that we will talk about today, as there's simply so much to talk about and I can only really quickly go over the most important things, is the Dragon War. As the humans had to come from Atmora, they also brought their animal-worshipping religion with them. And they saw the dragon on Atmora as the strongest and highest of all animals. They worshipped them most of all as the avatars of Akatosh, and as a human kingdom had established itself in Skyrim after the slaughter of the Snow Elves, dragons and with them dragon priests also came to Skyrim. Like in Atmora, the dragon priests eventually became the most influential figures in human society, as they directly conveyed the dragon's wishes to the population, and thus they basically were the mouth of the gods. But unlike on Atmora, the dragon priests did not just keep the peace between dragons and humans and ruled fairly. On Tamriel they actually became corrupt and ruled like tyrants, basically abusing their population. And this would eventually result into men rising up against the dragons and their priests, and a battle that they could not possibly win against the power of the dragons. However, something very interesting happened, as the goddess Kain decided to help the humans, because the goddess Kain instructed Parthenex, the lieutenant of Alduin, the leader of the dragons, to teach men the power of the Thu'um, or the voice. This made for a change in fortune, as the Dragon War was basically turning in the humans' favor. Because using the power of the voice, mankind started to slaughter the dragons one by one. They even created their own shout, which was made out of pure hatred for the dragons, the Dragon Rend shout, which forced the dragons to face the concept of mortality and made them weaker. The Dragon War eventually ended when the champions of the Needs of Skyrim banished Alduin, the leader of the dragons, through space and time using an Elder Scroll. The end of the Dragon War resulted in a complete collapse and loss of power of the remaining dragon priests and their followers, and they were hunted down and scattered in hiding, trying to entomb the dragons that had died with the belief that Alduin would one day resurrect them, which we know that he did. What remained of the dragon cult all got hunted down or went into hiding. We know that some remnants of the dragon cult were even found until the First Era in one of the monasteries around Skyrim. But just like with the Snow Elves, some may have survived, but their power is very long gone, as they can no longer face the public. Now, the last thing we will talk about today are the Bosmer. They had built themselves a very tribal culture in Valenwood, much like the one that we already know these days. However, near the end of the Merethic era, something very drastically changed, as around the time of the end of the Merethic era, a leader of all Bosmer, a sort of king, emerged. His name was Epliar, and he managed to unite all the Bosmer through negotiation and military conquest under his banner, founding the Camoran dynasty and the Camoran kingdom of Valenwood. With the founding of this kingdom, he proclaimed that with the uniting of the Bosmer, a new era had begun. So he said that day that the first era began that day, and eventually all of Tamriel accepted this unit of time that he just had invented. This meant that the Merethic era had ended, which was essentially a period in which nobody kept the time and nobody kept the exact date, and the first era begins. a bit like the AD and BC system that we use today, as the Merethic era, in retrospect, is always viewed in negative numbers. So if you were saying the year ME 2000, when the humans officially landed, so the year 1000 of the Merethic era, that means 1000 years before the first era started. And ME 2000 would be 2000 years before the first era started. So the lower the number in Merethic era, the later it happened. While from the moment the first era started, we started using a sort of regular unit of time. And what will happen after the start of the first era, we will see in the next lecture. Now I hope that you still enjoyed this lecture. I think that for the next one I will once again split it in parts, maybe even in 3 parts, as there is just so much information on the first era in comparison to the Merethic era. I'm personally not really happy with this one, and as I had to skip over certain subjects way faster than I want. For example, the Dragon War, I wanted to say more about that, and I wanted to say more about Valley culture. But considering the format of these lectures and the sheer amount of information on some subjects, I have to limit myself to the global information to be able to cover it all, and I hope that you enjoyed it nonetheless. Now, this is basically the end of the lecture, and I'll switch my recording software if any of you has any questions, and with your consent I'll edit them into the final YouTube video if they're relevant to the subject, and you can of course ask everything you want, but it's just not gonna be in the final YouTube thing.
Okay, with your moving along through Tamriel, you kind of start with Somerset and talk about migration. One thing I might have mentioned would be Topol the pilot leading kind of the way in, initial exploration, discovering things, generating maps and whatever.
It's very funny that you say that, because I made the conscious decision to leave him out, as I had.
Really?
Yeah, I made a video especially on him, with the idea that, as I said before, I cannot delve into specifics very much, and especially Topol was a subject that I really wanted to do. Like, I was talking with Lady of Scrolls at one point. We were just playing some sort of game, and I was like, I still want to cover Topol, and that was just before I did the previous lore lecture, and I mentioned him really briefly in that. Like, I said something along the lines in my initial script that didn't reach the first reading. I said something along the lines of they arrived on Aridon and they set out explorers like Topol the pilot, etc. But if I did it in this lecture, I wouldn't have been able to do it more specifically than that, so I decided to just dedicate an entire video to him, and that's my reasoning.
Yeah.
As I don't know, he seemed to me like a more interesting subject than something that I just mentioned offhand, to be honest. But I don't know. Any other comments?
Yeah, there was that, and you do talk about the Nords and whatnot, a fair deal, but I noticed that there's not really any discussion on like the orcs, because if I'm not mistaken, the orcs became orcs during this time. Yep. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I talked it over with some people, and I looked it up, but there is a real, I don't know what it is, but there's a real toxic community that's like, okay, the orcs aren't elves, and the others say that the orcs are elves. Like, there's a story where the orcs are basically they are led away from the Somersets and are then transformed into the orcs as Altmer to orcs. But then there's also people that claim, but wait, the orcs were already on Tamriel according to some other material. I don't quite remember what it was. So they can't possibly be elves. I personally think that they are like evolved elves, since they can be used in the, like, their blood can be used in the Septimus Signus questline. Yeah. So that seemed to me like one of the most solid pieces of evidence. But then there are the immediate reaction that I get, like, you can't imagine how toxic some people are about this for some fucking reason. Like, it's just a game, please.
Yeah.
but then they're like, yeah, but what if without their blood it would have been enough? And I don't know. It's just stupid. But that's why I just mentioned that around that time the orcs would appear, or at least appear in history. That's what I mentioned in the lecture, I believe. And then they would settle in their own small kingdoms like Orsinium. There are multiple theories on what happened to the orcs, and I'll actually put this in the lecture since I think it's important to still stress this. There are multiple theories on what happened about the orcs, but there seems to be none that is very much accepted. However, I personally accept the version with Malakat and Trinamech, which leads to the orcs transforming from Aldmer into orcs. But there seems to be no consensus, and people seem to get angry all the time about it. So, yeah, I don't quite understand that. Maybe you have some, like, filler to that, or what's the...
Well, I would certainly mention it, because it's not like this is a... Or you could even mention, like, you know, all the circumstances around how there are different theories and whatnot, but I would at least mention that, because it's not like the orcs are just like some kind of, like, little race that just disappeared and, you know... Moving on, we never see them again. No, they're still around, right? They're still a big deal.
But remember that this is basically an ongoing series, and a bit like the Aliots, basically like every race, most of their concrete history is in the First Era. Although we know that a lot of things, like scattered things, we know that happened during the Merethic era, but most of their concrete history is during the First Era and onwards. Although that's why I'm really afraid for the First Era, and I might actually chop it up into 3 parts, since it's just so much information, even more than this. So
sure, it's just the only thing is there's no other time to do that, or talk about their origins, because this is where it happens, right? So
yeah,
excluding it is
I
just
agree.
totally...
That's why I probably will edit it into the thing.
Then the only other thing, comment-wise, would be possibly regarding the startup of the Bretons, because, like, the Nedic population, like, you know, if you go too much farther down the line in history, like, there's going to be no opportunity to even mention them. And, you know, if you look around parts of Hammerfell, like, they still have large ruins and whatnot, and eventually help turn into the Bretons. So I don't know, it might be something to also mention at the same time.
The Bretons, this is just from my memory, because this is what I mentioned in my script for the First Era thing. Once the North started expanding, this is a little bit into First Era, but I can mention it now. The Bretons' first mention of existence was when the North started expanding even further than Skyrim, when they started expanding into Morrowind, and then later started expanding into High Rock. And then they found a race which they thought were elves, but then they just spoke some sort of Nedic language, and then they saw in them a sort of weird mix between Bretons and between Needs and elves. I made the decision, since this lecture was already pretty long, to mention that along with the whole Nordic Empire expansion. But I have to agree that maybe that's not my most smart decision. Let me look it up around what time frame that would be.
Yeah, because the only reason why I would more strongly consider putting it in rather than taking it out is because if you don't mention it now, it's not like the Nedic civilization has so much going on in the First Era, so it's just like, this is your only opportunity to ever mention it, type thing.
Yeah, you're right. Wait, let me write it down real quick.
And it's not like, yeah, I just think it's, you know, relatively important. So
I also have to say that I kind of agree with you, as while I was reading this, I kind of like I've written this lecture, I think now about a month back, or maybe even a bit longer. And once I was reading this, especially in retrospective to now that I'm working on the First Era one, I was also coming at a point where I was like, I don't really mention the Bretons in this, and like I knew that they weren't in it, but mentally I was also like, maybe I should have mentioned them in a specific place, but I'm trying to find the place where I was like in my head, here should I have mentioned them? Oh, right here. Wait, let me.
Yeah, like better things to cut. I mean, it's like, yeah, the Maormer are around at this time, but like eventually down the line, once you get into the more important things shaping Tamriel after the Merethic area, like that's not them. So like, you know, they would be less important to mention versus something like the Orsimer, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. Right, any further comments?
I had one on the... It's not really, like, relevant, but it was on the Aldemaris theory. You said, like, the...
Please don't hold it against me, I don't know it from the top of my head.
No, this is just kind of like my own personal kind of input.
Sure thing.
And probably other people may have thought of this. But, like, you said, like, their civilization on Aldemaris was more, like, entirely industrial, and they didn't have, like, nature. They like, built so much over it. The way I, like, feel like why they may have moved, like, in terms of, like, a doom, is that they, you know, they ran out of resources, maybe? Like, you know, because they can't really thrive on a continent that's entirely construction and, like, building and stuff, so I don't know. I feel like if that is a theory, I feel like that could be one. But, I mean, obviously it's not really, like...
I would say the same, but disclaimer that I'm not a specialist on this, and maybe Mr. Goodfella can actually fill me in on this once I finish. To my knowledge, the elves had already, or the Aldmer had already basically filled their continent a long time before the migration. So for some reason they were fine for a really long time on their like big city without much nature in it, and then suddenly they had to move away. So I wouldn't call it a lack of resources. I think that they would have some magical means of doing that, but this is from the top of my head, so maybe Mr. Goodfella, who I know has a lot of elvish history knowledge, can back me up on this or disprove my theory. Yeah.
I didn't catch part of it. Yeah, I don't know anything about Aldemaris, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's...
I'm not sure anybody does.
Yeah, we don't really know all that much. All we have is, unfortunately, theories. But you could be right in that sense. But it doesn't... It crossed my mind, but I don't quite know what that doom was. So I just left it at a doom.
Basically, what I was trying to ask was, is there any chance that the Khajiit could have been high elves that somehow mutated into catfolk?
So, my personal theory on this is, based on facts at least, is that there were two, this is a fact, there were two groups of main ancestors. You had the Elnofey, and you had the Wandering Elnofey, and you had the Old Elnofey inhabitants, and those were two groups that both originated in the original Elnofey. Now the Old Elnofey inhabitants, they became the races of elves that we know now, and the Wandering Elnofey, they became the races of humans. Now, something that I mentioned in my lecture, either in the Dawn era or the Merethic era, I don't quite know which one it was, is that these races, the Wandering Elnofey inhabitants and the no, not the Wandering Elnofey inhabitants, sorry. The Wandering Elnofey and the Old Elnofey inhabitants, they had a war, which was called the Elnofey War. And this war split Nirn into different parts, which became the continent. So this war, it scarred Nirn in such a way that there became different continents like Tamriel, Yokuda, Akavir, etc. I think, this is my theory, that after this, the Elnofey and the Wandering Elnofey and the Old Elnofey inhabitants, they got scattered all around. And I think that on Aldemaris, a group of Old Elnofey inhabitants got itself isolated, which evolved into the Aldmer with a D. And on Tamriel, I also think that a group of Old Elnofey inhabitants got isolated, which evolved into the Khajiit. So I think that this is my theory, that the Old Elnofey inhabitants that were isolated on Tamriel evolved into the Khajiit, meaning that the Khajiit and the Altmer have a common ancestor. So the High Elves, which evolved from the Altmer, have the same ancestor in my theory as the Khajiit, but you have to see it like yeah, you have one origin point, which is the Elnufei, which evolved into the old Elnufei inhabitants eventually. If that was even an evolution or just a cultural divide, we don't know. And these old Elnufei inhabitants, they evolved into the precursors of the Khajiit and evolved into the precursors of the High Elves. Meaning that, yes, they have a common ancestor somewhere, but right now they are so far away, they've evolved so far away due to their long time isolation on different continents, that you can rightfully call them another race. So, yes, they are related, but no, they are not as directly related as you propose in your question, if that answers your question even a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alright. If that was it, then I'll destroy this server, because last time I left it open for way too long.